It all began with a single announcement that shook not only North America, but the entire world. Early one morning, the White House issued a terse statement. The United States was officially ending all trade negotiations with Canada. There were no qualifiers, no deadlines, no explanations beyond a vague assertion that the move was in defense of American interests. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire, dominating headlines, television coverage, and social media feeds. Markets reacted instantly. Business leaders scrambled, and millions of ordinary people, from farmers to factory workers, realized that a long-standing economic partnership had just been fractured. A U.S. Canada trade relationship had been considered one of the most stable in modern history. Every day, billions of dollars in goods crossed their shared border. Automotive plants in Michigan depended on steel and PARs from Ontario. Canadian grain fed American markets. Energy pipelines stretched hundreds of miles across borders. Millions of jobs were intertwined with the invisible threads of cross-border commerce. That balance, built over decades, relied on predictability and trust, and now suddenly it was gone. A trigger for this abrupt rupture was seemingly minor yet symbolically charged. A Canadian advertisement had used archival footage of former President Ronald Reagan to promote provincial trade initiatives. While some considered it a harmless marketing effort, the U.S. president interpreted it as disrespectful and manipulative, a slight that could not be overlooked. In Washington, advisors debated whether this was a calculated strategy or an impulsive decision, but the statement made one thing clear: trade talks were over. Fallout was immediate. Stock markets in Toronto and New York wavered. The Canadian dollar slipped, and investors worldwide grew nervous. Border crossings, once smooth and predictable, became chaotic as companies worried about delays, tariffs. It began with a single post that sent ripples across the globe. A brief statement issued just after dawn from the White House press office declared that all trade negotiations between the United States and Canada were officially terminated. There were no further details, no explanation, no caveats, just the blunt message that one of the world's closest trading partnerships was over. Within minutes, financial markets began to stir. By the time the sun rose over Washington, the shockwave had already reached every major capital in the world. For decades, the relationship between the U.S. and Canada had been described as unbreakable, a model of modern economic cooperation. Billions of dollars in goods crossed their shared border each day, and entire industries depended on the stability of that connection. Automobiles built in Michigan carried parts made in Ontario. Oil pipelines stretched from Alberta to Texas, and millions of jobs thrived under the quiet rhythm of mutual trust. That rhythm was suddenly broken. A first wave of panic began in Ottawa. Government aides rushed to secure emergency meetings. Economists scrambled to assess the fallout, and journalists flooded the steps of Parliament seeking answers. The Prime Minister's cabinet, blindsided, was forced into a closed-door session within the hour. Inside questions swirled. Was this another bluff, a negotiation tactic, or had the U.S. president truly decided to dismantle the foundation of North American trade? And while in Washington, the corridors of power buzzed with speculation. Some advisors insisted that the move was calculated, a show of strength aimed at extracting better terms. Others whispered that it was impulsive, born of personal irritation rather than policy. A video advertisement from Ontario had reportedly used the voice of former President Ronald Reagan in a message supporting Canadian tariff policies. By mid-morning, stock markets in New York and Toronto were trembling. The Canadian dollar slid sharply, and investors scrambled to pull out of cross-border funds. American agriculture groups warned of instant disruptions in grain exports. Car manufacturers issued cautious statements urging calm, and shipping companies began to prepare for delays at customs points. In the background, media networks switched to rolling coverage, looping footage of trucks crossing snowy border stations, intercut with fiery headlines. Trade talks dead. Trump terminates deals with Canada. In Michigan, factory owners watched with disbelief. Many had lived through years of trade renegotiations, tariffs, and policy shifts, but nothing like this. A sudden halt to talks didn't just mean stalled contracts. It meant uncertainty, the kind that eats into every corner of an economy. On social media, hashtags like Trade War North, Shark Canada Crisis began to trend. Supporters of the administration hailed the move as a patriotic stand against foreign manipulation. Critics warned it would cripple small businesses on both sides of the border. As the day unfolded, the story evolved from confusion to confrontation. Political commentators framed it as the beginning of a new era in American foreign policy, one less about diplomacy and more about dominance. Canada's measured response did little to calm the situation. The Prime Minister, as press secretary, released a restrained statement emphasizing respect for our long-standing partnership while urging for clarity and dialogue, but clarity did not come. Behind the scenes, White House staffers were already fielding calls from alarmed governors and CEOs. Supply chains that stretched from Quebec to California were in jeopardy. Trucks already en route faced questions about inspection delays. Ports began bracing for disruptions. The ripple effect was immediate and relentless. Television anchors began speaking of a continental economic freeze. 3. Meanwhile, in the digital world, the story transformed into spectacle. Influencers dissected it like an unfolding drama. Some posted memes showing maps of North America split by a jagged line. Others edited footage of the president announcing the decision with dramatic music and titles like "The Day Trade Died." YouTube channels churned out analyses, speculations, and theories, each trying to capture the storm of attention sweeping across the internet. Internationally, leaders from Europe and Asia watched closely. For them, the collapse of talks between the two North American giants hinted at instability that could spread. Some countries saw opportunity. If the U.S. and Canada fell out, there would be openings for new trade partners, new supply routes, and new alliances. Others feared contagion, the possibility that the U.S. might abandon or revise other trade relationships just as abruptly. By late afternoon, the White House press room was packed. Reporters demanded explanations. A senior aide stepped to the podium, repeating the official stance that the administration would no longer tolerate deceptive or disrespectful practices from foreign governments. The words did little to clarify the situation, but they fueled the fire networks, ran breaking news banners nonstop, while economic analysts filled airtime with projections of losses that could reach into the hundreds of billions. In Ottawa, the mood grew heavier. Inside the glass towers of government, Canadian officials debated how to respond. Some advocated retaliation, tariffs, restrictions, diplomatic protest. Others warned against escalation. The public, meanwhile, was anxious and angry. Protesters gathered outside Parliament carrying signs urging calm, while business leaders pleaded for stability. Across Canada's industrial heartlands, workers began to ask what the future would hold. As night fell, the world's attention fixed on one question. Was this the beginning of a new trade war or a temporary storm that would soon pass? In newsrooms from London to Tokyo, editors rewrote their headlines to capture the drama of the moment. Trump ends trade talks with Canada, allies stunned, markets reel. It wasn't just a political decision anymore. It was a global story, one that touched the core of modern economics and diplomacy. The president's decision, made in apparent defiance of decades of precedent, had opened a door that no one quite knew how to close. Even those closest to him seemed uncertain of what might come next. For the first time in a generation, the U.S. and Canada were standing on opposite sides of a widening divide. And as the world tried to make sense of it all, one truth became undeniable: history was shifting in real time. The calm familiarity of the North American partnership was gone, replaced by a storm that promised to reshape borders, economies, and alliances alike. The night ended with silence from both capitals, but beneath that silence lay tension and the uneasy awareness that the real consequences had yet to unfold. The morning after the announcement brought no relief, only confusion across the northern border. The headlines filled every newspaper stand, from Vancouver to Halifax. Television anchors spoke with strained voices, balancing caution with disbelief. The words "trade freeze" appeared in bold type across front pages, a phrase that quickly came to symbolize the unfolding uncertainty. In the calm neighborhoods of Ottawa, commuters moved through the streets with an unusual quiet, radios tuned to continuous coverage. Business owners refreshed news feeds, searching for signs that the decision might be reversed. Truck drivers hauling goods between Ontario and Michigan waited at checkpoints for new instructions, but no new orders came. For the first time in decades, the seamless rhythm of North American trade had faltered. The Canadian Prime Minister's office released a somber statement by mid-morning. It promised restraint, dialogue, and patience. But behind the polished words lay the growing recognition the situation was spiraling faster than diplomacy could manage. Trade ministers assembled in emergency sessions, and legal experts began reviewing existing treaties for potential breaches. Meanwhile, the opposition seized on the chaos, accusing the government of complacency and weakness. The political temperature was rising in both capitals. South of the border, American networks replayed footage of the president's latest rally, in which he had doubled down on his stance. He described the Canadian government's actions as deceitful and disrespectful, portraying his decision as a defense of American pride and sovereignty. To his supporters, it was a display of strength, proof that no country, not even a friendly neighbor, could take the United States for granted. To his critics, it was reckless brinkmanship. Commentators on late-night shows dissected the move with a mix of alarm and fascination. The markets reflected the mood in New York. Stocks connected to cross-border logistics, manufacturing, and agriculture took heavy hits. In Toronto, the financial sector watched billions in value evaporate in a single trading day. Economists called it a panic of perception, a reaction driven less by concrete change and more by the fear of what could come next. Yet fear, as history has shown, can move economies faster than policy ever could. By noon, the first reports of real-world disruption began to appear. At the Detroit-Windsor border crossing, one of the busiest trade arteries on the continent, trucks lined up for miles. Customs officers, unsure of new inspection guidelines, slowed processing to a crawl. Perishable goods sat in refrigerated trailers, wasting precious hours. Canadian farmers feared that soon their crops would have nowhere to go. On the American side, in Alberta, oil executives held crisis calls with their American partners. Pipelines that had once carried millions of barrels of crude across the border were now under scrutiny. Would tariffs follow the end of negotiations? Would transport permits be revoked? Nobody knew. For an industry already under pressure from fluctuating prices, the uncertainty felt like a ticking clock. Amid the growing panic, a curious thing began to happen on social media. The story took on a life of its own. Hashtags turned the diplomatic dispute into an entertainment spectacle. Edited videos of the president's announcement went viral, remixed with dramatic music and flashing headlines. Some users celebrated the move as a declaration of independence. Others mocked it as self-sabotage. News channels competed to produce the most sensational graphics, portraying the border as a literal croc running through the continent. The story had escaped the control of politicians and entered the realm of viral mythology. In Ottawa, ministers struggled to contain the narrative. The Prime Minister met with advisors in a secure conference room, maps of trade routes projected across the walls. They discussed contingency plans, alternate markets in Asia, emergency subsidies for affected industries, public messaging to prevent panic. Each option carried risks. Every hour of indecision fed the perception of weakness, a perception that the government could ill afford. Meanwhile, in Washington, lobbying groups mobilized representatives from the auto, steel, and agriculture sectors began pressing Congress for intervention. They argued that sudden rupture endangered American jobs as much as Canadian ones. A handful of governors from border states drafted a joint letter urging reconsideration, warning that their regional economies were too intertwined to survive a prolonged freeze. Behind closed doors, White House aides debated how to respond. As the second day wore on, the first diplomatic back channels opened. The Canadian ambassador in Washington reached out to senior members of the State Department seeking clarification. The response was measured but firm. The president's decision stood. There would be no talks until further notice. No timeline, no exceptions. The message was clear. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate break. In cities along the border, people began to feel the weight of the decision in tangible ways. Small businesses that depended on cross-border customers reported empty stores. Truck stops grew crowded with idle vehicles and restless drivers. Farmers' cooperatives started to pool their resources, hoping to weather the uncertainty. In news interviews, faces appeared tired, voices strained. Words like shock, betrayal, and disbelief echoed across both nations. Yet beneath the chaos, there were whispers of something deeper, a quiet recalibration of national identity. In America, the move reignited old debates about sovereignty and globalism. In Canada, it stirred conversations about independence and self-reliance. Some saw in the crisis an opportunity to diversify, to step out from the shadow of their powerful neighbor. Others feared that the damage to trust would take generations to mend. Late that night, a cold wind swept across the Great Lakes, carrying with it the unease of two nations uncertain of their next move. News anchors signed off with grim faces, promising updates that never seemed to bring clarity. The world watched in anticipation, knowing that whatever came next would define more than just trade. It would define the balance of power on the continent. And somewhere in the darkness, within the fortified halls of power in Washington, the president's inner circle met again. Reports suggested new orders were being drafted, measures that would tighten control over certain imports, extend tariffs, and further solidify America's stance. 8. By the end of the first week, the calm of denial had vanished. What began as a political statement had hardened into a full-fledged economic crisis. The numbers, once abstract and distant, were now painfully real. Shipments were stuck at ports, factories were slowing production, prices were rising across entire sectors. For the first time in years, the cross-border supply chain powered North America had fractured. In Washington, the administration framed the chaos as temporary turbulence, a necessary cost, reclaiming what it called economic sovereignty. Supporters echoed the sentiment on talk shows and social media. insisting that short-term pain would lead to long-term independence. But markets have no patience for ideology. Every hour that passed without resolution cost millions. Investors pulled out. Retailers raised prices to cover delays. The first layoffs began quietly hidden within corporate statements about restructuring. In the heart of Detroit, the auto industry felt the impact. First, assembly lines built on Canadian steel, precision parts began to stall. Production schedules collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Union leaders met in tense gatherings, trying to reassure workers that solutions were being pursued. But the truth was harder to disguise. Without a steady flow of materials from Canada, the backbone of American manufacturing was cracking. In Toronto, the story was equally grim. Export-dependent companies faced canceled orders. Agricultural cooperatives that once supplied U.S. supermarkets now had warehouses filled with unsold goods. The Canadian dollar continued its downward slide, its value eroding day by day. Banks began tightening credit. The mood across the nation shifted from disbelief to defiance. The government, under growing pressure, began discussing countermeasures, tariffs, retaliatory restrictions, or appeals to international trade bodies. 9. Meanwhile, international observers watched with unease. European and Asian markets trembled at the sight of two of the world's most stable economies turning inward. Financial analysts began to use words like contagion, warning that the North American conflict could trigger a chain reaction in global supply chains. The world's major economies depended on the predictability of U.S. Canadian cooperation. Without it, the entire map of global trade seemed uncertain. In households across both nations, the crisis became personal. Grocery stores quietly raised prices on imported foods. Gas stations reflected the volatility of energy markets. Families planning holidays across the border canceled their trip amid reports of long waits and new customs restrictions. Tourism, a quiet pillar of the North American partnership, faltered almost overnight. Border towns that once thrived on shared commerce began to look deserted. The media captured every angle of the storm. Cable news filled its screens with red and blue charts, maps covered in arrows, and headlines that warned of the North American trade collapse. Economists argued in split-screen debates about who would blink first. Commentators framed it as a battle of wills, a test of political endurance. For the president, the narrative was simple. America was standing up for itself. For Canada, it was a struggle for dignity and survival. And for the world, it was a reminder that alliances could crumble faster than anyone imagined. Within the White House, divisions deepened. Some advisors pushed for back-channel diplomacy, arguing that quiet talks could ease tensions without public embarrassment. Others urged confrontation, seeing the crisis as proof that America's allies had grown too comfortable. The president reportedly sided with the latter. Every statement he made reinforced his resolve. The tone was unmistakable, unapologetic, almost triumphant.